Okay, so we've got volume, which should be good. I'm going to make sure closed caption is available for people who need that. So you should all start seeing that. So good evening and welcome to the August 2nd Churchill Borough Planning Commission. Mr. Chairman, Megan, the meeting is yours.
Okay, well, welcome to the Churchill Planning Commission meeting. First on the agenda is a call to order. Roll call.
Yes, of course, Megan, you're here. And Diane Law.
Here.
Dick Kelly, you're Dan Zeidel here, and Mike Moida here. So everyone's present in the room. We do have a few guests. There's 5 people joining us online via Zoom.
Welcome. Okay, we are, I guess, go right into public comment. We're here tonight to talk about the ordinance of the Borough of Churchill, amending the borough zoning ordinance to revise certain definitions and add new definitions, to amend table 201, permitted uses, conditional uses, yard and area requirements, and to amend the regulations related to distribution centers.
So I'm kind of throwing a loop for you, and I didn't get a chance to talk to you about this. Gavin and I talked a little bit about it. He and I will kind of go over high level of kind of how we got here and how things connect and maybe help you connect the dots. One of the things Gavin and I talked about is public participation. Certainly the way we have it on the agenda is Gavin and I talk, the Zoom folks would raise their hand, we would acknowledge them, promote them to panelists, they get 3 minutes to speak. And then Jenny makes a presentation, then you all discuss the draft, and you have questions, comments, Jenny, Gavin, and I, Diane, who's been a part of this, could help answer those. The question we were kind of wondering was, do you want like any public comment like after Jenny's presentation, or is it fine to have it like at the beginning? Now, remember, we'll have other meetings or hearings on this subject going forward. This isn't the final night that this thing gets discussed, at least publicly, planning or the planning commission, yes, but theoretically, the council would be the next body to do it. So I'm not sure what your thoughts are.
I think my preference, and subject to what the commission says, I'd rather have all the presentations and then one question and answer session.
Yeah, so the question and answer would be you all questioning and answer. We're not saying that the public would be question and answer. They would do their normal public comment. Is that correct, Gavin?
You're right. So I mean, the borough has made this draft public since, I guess, the July meeting.
Correct.
So folks have had an opportunity to review it. Our thought was, again, little background from me and Alex, let folks kind of provide some input, the public, give them their 3 minutes for a piece. Then we'll close the public comment portion, have Jenny sort of dig into the meat and potatoes of the whole thing, discussion amongst the planning commission with us, Alex and I as well, and Jenny trying to answer any questions, and then, finish up with a vote to either recommend or not recommend the current version. So I guess the big question is do you want to have everything I just said and then just do the public comment, give them the 3 minutes a person after Jenny's presentation or before Jenny's presentation? That's the big question.
Yeah, after.
Okay.
Is my preference.
Good.
So just to be clear, if you're interested publicly in commenting, there's no too early or too late. Well, there would be a too late, but too early to put your hand up. But I will eventually at that point keep track of you, promote you to panelist, and permit you to speak and all that good stuff. So I guess Gavin, you would be next then.
Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay,
Please.
thank you, Madam Chair. So, what you folks have all been provided, what the public has been provided is a fairly sizable set of new commercial zoning regulations for the borough. And the way that this came about was sort of for years now, and Ms. Law can testify certainly better than most, we've been discussing the need to update the borough zoning ordinance. And in particular, the commercial zoning regulations, because as you folks know better than I do, Churchill Borough has essentially been a residential community with one commercial facility, if you set Scott's aside, one office complex and a research and development facility. So when this ordinance was initially drafted, the current zoning ordinance, there was really no need to have a robust set of commercial zoning regulations because people weren't really thinking about that. And since Westinghouse has essentially, scaled way back, it's only the hot cell property right now. And that property has sort of fallen into disrepair and non-use. We've had a number of developers, potential developers, come before the borough with, some ideas, some plans. Some of them went as far as the Amazon warehouse, as folks will recall, with after many, many hours of testimony, both here and before the council. And, the way that one was managed was, the borough council adopted sort of I don't want to say, stopgap, but at least to get some regulations governing warehouses, because that was one of a number of uses that were not provided for under the code. So as that property, the C1 district in total, because that's sort of the focus of these regulations, has continued to be undeveloped. The borough had been sort of waiting to see maybe who the next developer might be. Let's have a conversation to decide, what sort of project might be viable out there, and let's try to tailor the zoning ordinance so that would work. You want to balance, protecting the residents, obviously, while not, while making it viable for a developer. So, as we sort of, waited and waited and waited, the borough council got to a point where they said, look, we at least have to bring our set of regulations, our commercial zoning regulations, up to sort of a general standard, right? It might not be, the perfect, perfectly planned, with a lot of resources poured into it right off the bat, but let's at least update our zoning regulations so they're consistent with sort of neighboring communities, the general state of the art. So I say all that as background because the ordinance that's in front of you, it really is meant just to do that. It's not tailored to a specific type of project or development. It is simply to try to get the borough to address some inconsistencies in the ordinance, to define some uses that weren't defined at all, and for some of the uses, and Jenny Easton will go through this in more detail, but to give council and the borough more control over uses as they come through, shifting things to conditional uses rather than uses permitted by right, making sure the uses that are in certain districts make sense in those districts, and providing for a catch-all for undefined uses that would all be handled a certain way, that again, we'll go through. In addition, which I think is probably of particular interest to some of the folks who are paying attention, is the distribution center regulations, which again, we had none. Then the borough did decide to add distribution center regulations just prior to Amazon coming in. We went through that whole process, and that would have been, I believe, a 3 million square foot facility. Am I remembering that correctly?
A lot.
Right. This current draft, at least for the time being, significantly scales that type of distribution center back. We're still providing for the use, but not sort of a mega warehouse use. Now, the expectation is that, once this set of regulations is adopted, that the borough will continue on its planning process. Hopefully, we'll be able to engage with a potential developer of that site, and we'll be coming back in relatively short order to this planning commission for a more detailed discussion and fleshing out some additional zoning regulations, some additional detail, something that will take into account the potential use of that C1 property, so that this is not meant to be sort of the final best perfect document. This is meant to bring the borough's regulations up to kind of a standard that's consistent with neighboring municipalities.
And the intention of doing that is to give the borough more control. Because if something's not addressed, then the developer or somebody seeking the zoning issue has more power if it's not addressed.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, and this particular ordinance, because it's been advertised for a public hearing, it's been made available for the public. As long as there are no substantive changes between now and the time it's adopted, there's gonna be a public hearing, it looks like September 12th, most likely, after which the ordinance could be adopted. But assuming that there's no substantive changes that are made, which would require us to start over again, these regulations are what's called qualify for what's the pending ordinance doctrine, which means that even though they haven't been formally adopted, they are essentially in place should a developer, kind of want to run in and beat council to the punch of adopting this. And so that pending ordinance is for that very reason. It takes roughly 60 days to adopt any kind of zoning amendment. So once you advertise it to prevent the developer from, putting plans together, running into the borough and filing something, you're protected as long as you don't make substantive changes. So that maybe is a long way of just trying to get everyone up to speed as to how we got here. The borough has an ad hoc zoning committee that was appointed to work with myself, with Alex, with Jenny, to try to come up with these regulations to get us updated. So Alex, you want to?
Sure, just a little planning background. I assume most of you are familiar with it, but for those in the audience who may not, and hopefully they can hear me. If you can hear well, or if you can hear at all, I'd appreciate if a participant would raise their hand, simply because I usually have people at home who text me and help me know what is being heard out there. I don't have ability to know how things are going. So I see a hand raised, so that's great. Thank you, Cheryl. Shirley, we'll move on then. So the planning background is real simple. We've done a multi-municipal plan. It was adopted in 2018. The multi-municipal plan was Monroeville, Wilkins Township, and of course Churchill Borough. In 2019, to implement the plan, the borough received a grant. In 2020, executed the C1 vision plan. Again, many of you were part of that steering committee, and I still to this day am amazed how the team pulled it off. Paschik and the borough was able to kind of convert around March of 2020 to doing it entirely online. And if you remember, those videos are still online. There was a number of subject matter experts who were interviewed or did presentations about the market, about architecture, about land use planning and the environment, transportation, and so forth. And quite valuable and even very relevant today, despite all that's happened during COVID. And that was followed by 30 hours of your own meetings and 60 some hours of conditional use hearings at the borough council level. We heard a lot of public comment. We received thousands of comments and pages of comments that are all online. Many people, many of them, and I would imagine, supportive of the direction of what we're doing tonight, as Gavin has explained it. As we move forward with the more comprehensive look of the zoning, we'll have more opportunities for public participation. Suffice it to say that at this point, we've had plenty of public comment, and this all relates to the planning documents that you've worked on. The C1 vision, which was more or less adopted by the council in September of 2020, and of course the comprehensive plan, which was adopted in 2018. So that's just a little planning background. I think Gavin gets highlights. Okay, so with that, Jenny, you want to go ahead? I'll be your slide share, so I'm going to share your screen here.
Sure, I'll give you a meaningful look when it's time to flip slides.
Yeah, and if I'm bad at it, just tell me in advance. Sometimes I stop paying attention. So I need to put it in slide mode here one more moment. There's a little delay for you, so don't get nervous if it's like I told Alex to slide it and he's not doing it.
You're gonna have to come over there in that case.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jenny Easton. I'm a principal and planning director at Paschik MTR. We're a landscape architecture and community planning studio based on the north side. We're really pleased and honored to have the opportunity to build upon our past work with the borough and taking a look at fine tuning some zoning adjustments that'll help realize the vision the community created for the C1 zoning district and incorporate some best practices more generally. Over the years, our team has completed a significant amount of zoning work for Allegheny County municipalities. And I would say what stands out about Churchill's ordinance in comparison is that it's not really built to regulate potential commercial, industrial, and mixed-use development, presumably because until recent years, it didn't have to be. So as Gavin said, we want to spend some real time getting the C1 standards just right, calibrating them to enable and incentivize the highest and best use possible for that area. In the meantime, we recommend advancing a basic amendment just to reduce the risk of worst case scenario, the borough being unprepared if an application should happen to come in for a land use for which it doesn't have adequate regulations. We're proposing 3 categories of changes in the draft zoning amendment in your packet. We are going to suggest changes to definitions, adding them where they're now missing, and including some typical land uses that communities tend to classify and regulate. We'll suggest changes to the conditional use standards for particularly multifamily dwellings and distribution centers. Adding standards also where the present ordinance doesn't have them, to get some baseline protections in place. And we suggest updating the use table, enabling some mixed use, retail, office, and service uses as conditional in C1, and establishing some of the previously unregulated uses in C2, moving things around a bit to position these districts for their best outcomes. With regard to definitions, the list you see on the slide there is already in the ordinance in the use table, but it does not appear in the terms defined in the definitions chapter. We recommend adding definitions to make enforcement simpler and more fair. Everybody should be clear on exactly what each use entails. The definitions we suggest for these are informed by best practices, how other communities typically regulate these kind of things. Next is this list of commonly regulated land uses that are not mentioned in the current ordinance. In order to regulate a use, you have to classify it. So we suggest adding definitions for these, as well as some use-specific conditions and assigning districts where they should be permitted or not. Some of these topics arise a lot if you're in the day-to-day of zoning discussions in these communities, because some of them tend to be higher impact. Maybe animal-related uses could be noisy or smelly. Obviously, a gasoline station or light industrial development has some externalities you want to have control over. Again, our suggested definitions for these terms reflect general best practices.
Jenny, can I interject
Of
too?
course.
Just, I know you may be covering this later on, but I always like to remind folks about the sort of fundamental rule about exclusionary zoning. You know, people might see some of these uses on there and say, why the heck are we, providing for that particular use? And just so folks remember, any lawful use must be provided for in every municipality. So that part of the reason we're getting out in front of these is because we are silent or lacking in regulation. So I just wanted to mention that. Thanks.
Yes, excellent point. All right, next please, Alex. I want to point out two specific definitions for restaurant, recognizing that that's an ever-changing industry, especially post-COVID. We broke this into different classifications for fast food versus a sit-down dining experience versus counter service, which might look like a takeout joint or a ghost kitchen. Each of these tends to have different parking, traffic flow, and some other characteristics that make them worth regulating differently. With regard to retail, the current ordinance caps the footprint of a retail store at 8,000 square feet in the definition. We propose adding a community retail category for larger stores, assuming that this might be a potentially desired use to incorporate in C1. 8,000 square feet is an appropriate neighborhood scale retail store. We suggest the limit at 120,000 square feet with the following in mind. Here on the slide are some national averages for floor area of various types of retail development. A limit at 120,000 square feet would allow most of the categories here. So inline tenants, those would be the small stores and open air centers that kind of fill the space between the anchor tenants. It would allow pad retail or those out parcel sites, kind of the freestanding space you see adjacent to shopping centers to complement the tenant mix. So those look like banks, coffee shops, maybe a Chick-fil-A. 120,000 square feet would permit a smaller format supermarket, maybe also a smaller format warehouse club, like a small Costco, perhaps a Target. But that limit would exclude something like a super Walmart, which tends to be larger, closer to 200,000 square feet. Another important thing that this amendment accomplishes is clarifying what happens to uses that aren't listed in the ordinance. So currently it's kind of both ways. One part of the ordinance says that such uses are not permitted, whereas a different section says that they're conditional. We suggest making them conditional in C2 only. On to new standards for conditional uses. So to focus on two here, the ordinance does have some pretty basic provisions now for multifamily dwellings. We suggest adding some additional standards specifically to enhance landscaping and site configuration. For distribution centers, we suggest articulating a scale limitation. 75,000 square feet is the recommendation for footprint and 40 foot in height. Here's the context for those numbers. As you know, distribution centers have become kind of a different animal over the course of the last decade. The typologies that are getting built now would have been perhaps unimaginable even a few years ago, but warehousing and distribution keep growing to serve ever more insatiable demand for e-commerce. So these facilities keep scaling to match. The high cube automated distribution center you see here, that type is very tall, up to 14 stories. Robots are the primary workforce for those. Last mile facility can range between maybe 50,000 square feet to more than 100,000 square feet. These see more van traffic. And as I know you're quite familiar, a major distribution center covers more than 500,000 square feet. So we're suggesting that Churchill cap distribution center footprints at this time at 75,000 square feet. We're looking there on the smaller end of the last mile facilities. The state planning code does require that each municipality provide for each type of land use within its corporate boundary, but not necessarily that every use may be permitted to exist at every possible scale and intensity. So here are the other uses for which we're proposing specific standards. The standards would be in place to control potential impacts and to the extent possible, require the best possible design and configuration for the site. So we're talking buffers, road access, lighting, landscaping, those kind of specifications. Some of these categories, you'll see in the ordinance have very simple standards. The important thing we think is to have some criteria in place. And the list goes on. The final piece here is the use table. So on this slide that you're seeing now, we're looking at just what's permitted by right in the C1 and C2 districts. We're comparing current, what's in the ordinance right now, versus proposed, what the amendment suggests. If it's in red, it means we're proposing removing it from that classification. Green means we're proposing adding it. So, for example, you see research lab is permitted by right in C1 today, but it's in red because we suggest moving it to conditional use in C1 and adding some standards. In general, we suggest classifying most uses in C1 as conditional for now, to build in that added layer of review until we complete kind of the ultimate zoning amendment with more specific requirements for that district. On the second slide here, we're comparing the current proposed conditional uses for C1 and C2. So same color scheme applies. You see on the top there that church is in red for both C1 and C2, meaning that it's currently conditional. We propose moving it just to C2, as this is not a use that will generate tax revenue, and broadening the definition to the more inclusive place of worship. This use is allowed in some of the residential districts as well. You'll also notice that most of our new uses listed here, they're conditional to either C1 or C2. That's again about adding a layer of review for the time being. Some of the uses we've classified as conditional in C2 are those higher impact types, potentially incompatible with the vision articulated for C1. So that's the overview.
Okay, can I add one,
Yes.
just back up on the conditional use? And I know all of us in this room are very familiar with that. And frankly, most of the borough, after going through the Amazon warehouse, is probably very familiar with it. But the difference between a use that's permitted by right would be you simply file an application, pay the filing fee, and then the zoning officer / manager / all the other hats that he wears would issue your zoning approval. Whereas a conditional use is a use that is permitted, but only after a public hearing, and it's up to the applicant to establish by evidence, testimony, expert reports that they meet all the criteria of the zoning code, and then they get their approval. So just want to make sure for folks who I'm talking to through the owl that they recall that process.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
I should have offered this earlier. I do actually have extra copies printed. Does anyone in the room want a printed copy of those slides? No. Okay, just in case I forgot, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
Very good presentation.
Thank you.
I'll share. So I guess we have two things. We did forget to do meeting minutes, which we can do at the end. So is it now that we want to allow for public comment by raising of hands? I'll promote to the
Yes.
presenters. Okay, so don't let us forget later on. We'll want to look at the minutes. So I have two people currently who have their hands raised. I'm going to go ahead and promote them. You'll see notices for those of you at home that you're being promoted. Please accept the promotion. And if you wish, turn on your camera and unmute yourself and you may begin to speak. If you have your hand up inadvertently and do not want to be promoted, do not accept the promotion. So Kathy, I think you should be, okay, so both of them declined to be panelists, which means they were raising their hand to say they could hear, which we wanted them to do and asked them to do that earlier. With that being said, there appears to be no public comment at this point. I'll give it another minute.
Yeah. I'll wait a minute.
Looks like no one has taken advantage of that.
Discussion? My only, well, not my only, but some of the comments that I had in reviewing this is that some of the definitions seem dated. But I think you addressed that earlier, that this is not the final go round, that they'll probably be a bit more polished as we go through the process. You know, for instance, a gasoline service station. I don't think we have those anymore. Most of them,
We may be the only one with tykes.
right, yeah, well, and how long that's gonna be around, you
Yeah.
know?
I mean, that's
It
a
should
new
include-
hall, that's a couple other uses as well.
Right.
Yeah.
But it should address the electric area, you know, because you could have, electrical vehicle, set up a
Vehicle fueling station.
Yeah.
Yeah.
called a fueling station, instead of a gasoline service station. You know, yeah, a lot of just minor issues of like that, of that nature, that are just more up to date, you know. I had some questions on funeral homes, are they the same as a crematorium, and I guess there is a slight distinction. But we don't address that. Anybody else have comments?
The new ordinances that were passed earlier in the year, the short-term rental and the cell towers, are they not in the ordinance yet? I mean,
I'm not sure if general code has drafted them, so what ends up happening is after we pass an ordinance on E code 360, I'll submit them to general code for their drafting into the ordinance,
okay,
and they end up moving on our code as past legislation. So a developer looking at any local government's online code is gonna wanna look at that past legislation as a cross-reference.
all right.
They're pretty good at general code, at getting them in there. I'm always surprised how quickly, you know, back in the day, we would get printed updates to put into your binders, but they seem to get them pretty quick. I don't know if they're there now. I can figure that out probably by the end of the night.
No, I don't see them.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so.
But that's where they would be, and if you look at our code, there's a part that says like past legislation.
Yeah, that's where I found
Yeah,
it.
that's where they're residing until they find a way inside the code.
Just in, and then the chicken coop too, I'm just curious in case I want to build a chicken coop, so. I want to be right,
Yeah, that should all be in there.
I think it is, I think that one is,
Flashbacks.
seriously.
Yeah, so yeah, these will also, when this ordinance, if and when this ordinance is adopted, you know, it will also be kind of thrown to E code 360, and then those will all sort of be churned together, and then at the end, we should have a very kind of clean document that will all be codified with the proper section numbers and everything, so. But they are, those regulations are in place, that's maybe not properly in the right place in the code right now.
I think this fills a lot of gaps that I, quite frankly, was surprised that we didn't have in there. Like, I've seen this, a lot of this in other codes in my travels, and it's like, oh, we didn't have that. So this is a good start.
And that's been the conversation at the council level, as Diane will testify to. We really have been, but when an issue is presented, you know, if a member of the public raises it, or, you know, we're just talking amongst ourselves or at a committee meeting, we kind of we always flip into the zoning code, and we say, oh, big surprise, we don't have that one covered. So, you know, to your point, that's exactly the goal here, is to fill in those gaps.
And will probably continue to be new things we think of it needing to add as the world evolves.
Yeah, but they always refer to zoning ordinances as like a living document, you know, it's never done. And especially as new uses come through, as, you know, the borough's presented with new projects, you know, and I want to be clear too publicly, you know, this is not meant to kind of scare away development at that site. This is, as I said, to kind of just fill in those gaps. I think I'm not speaking out of turn when I say that the borough is very willing to work with a developer who may have a different idea for that site, that maybe isn't a great fit for this particular set of zoning regulations, but they can, you know, come to the borough, present, you know, kind of their idea, and as long as it's balances sort of, again, the viability of the project with protecting the residents, you know, my sense from the council is they'd be very open to having that conversation. And if you have folks who do have detailed notes, because I know there was a lot of material here, please hold on to those because they will, you know, we do want that input, especially as we're kind of fine tuning this into, you know, the better next version. So that is not work that's going to waste, even if there's nothing we want to discuss particularly tonight in light of the circumstances. But hang on to that stuff, provide it to Alex, however you want to do that, because that's valuable input.
And for clarification, where is the C2 commercial district?
That is located on the north side of the Parkway East, generally the BOC Planning area, as well as the Road area.
Across the road from the
There
Clipchamp.
are a couple orphans of C2. I don't know the right word, that's the right word to use, but there's one, if you're going on the Road section towards Turtle Creek, before you get to the bridge on Route 22 into Wilkins or to Carl's,
Yeah.
there's a little dip down there. If you remember, there was used to be a realty office that wanted to become a single family home.
Yeah.
And that happens to be, and then there's another portion of C2 that lies somewhere in that Road Parkway ramp system that doesn't seem to be clearly contiguous. And it might be only because the Parkway is so divisive in that area, it's hard to have a contiguous track. But for the most part, I think Bullock's Pen and irrevocable trust that currently the Caesar property, that billboard is being proposed. And on August 28th, the zoning hearing board is taking up their variance requests and their special exception requests to do that. So if you want another public meeting in August, you're welcome to attend and watch that online or in person.
Okay.
So in C2 now is that house, it used to be the realtor's office.
Correct. That might be the only property generating taxes in that district.
And that's now a residence, right? She still live there?
I'm assuming that's the case.
That's whether it's the same individual or not, I'm not sure, but that it use as the
It's still
residential.
residential. Okay. Okay, any other comments for us up here?
No, good.
All right, do we make anybody want to move to make a recommendation to the borough council on the proposed ordinance?
I make a motion, we recommend to council, that they approve the draft of the amendments to the ordinance that we reviewed tonight.
I'll second that.
Okay, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Is that unanimous?
Well, usually when there's motion made, isn't there discussion? So it's okay, it's fine, go ahead, move on. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Then we make a recommendation to the council to adopt a resolution.
And then you have meeting minutes to consider, and then I think that's it.
I read the meeting minutes, I say the recommend that we pass it. Anybody have any changes?
That looks fine to me.
Okay, second,
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, and they are passed. Thank you very much. I guess with that, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Okay.